Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, Director of Policy at the Franklin Center, and today I'm joined by
Carrie Sheffield with Bold.
Yeah, thanks for coming on with me, Carrie. I wanted to talk to you today because you are a media startup entrepreneur, and in today's kind of media environment, what you guys are doing at Bold seems very interesting to me. And I wanted to talk to you kind of about your experience with a new media startup. But first off, do you want to give some of our listeners a little taste of what Bold Media is, what your goals were in starting a media startup, and kind of what you guys have been working towards? Because you did just celebrate your 1-year anniversary, which is pretty impressive for a media startup.
Thank you. So first of all, Kevin, it's great to be here. I've been a big fan of Blogging Heads for a long time, so I'm excited to make my debut. And so our company is Bold. We launched on November 30th, 2015, so we just hit our 1-year mark a few weeks ago. And our website, you can check it out, is www.bold.global, bold.global. And we are a startup that is aiming to be really a bipartisan conversation about news and politics, and also trying to talk to non-traditional conservatives and give them a voice, particularly in urban areas, also young people and just people who have been kind of left behind.
Sure. So give me kind of a flavor as someone who's heading up a media startup, where you go from like the conception of your idea to putting it into practice and maybe evolving. Because I've seen, I've been following Bold. I love your work, been following it for a long time. And I've seen it, the site and what you guys have been doing kind of shift in focus over your first year. So how does that process go? How do you go from having the concept to what you are and kind of evolving into what you want to be?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And we had talked a little bit about this before, about how it has kind of evolved in terms of when I was first planning Bold, I was very inspired by the Huffington Post and also Mike.com, just in terms of the voices they were able to get together and collect. But they were very left-leaning. And so what I said was, I'm going to make my right-wing Huffington Post or my right-wing Mike.com. And since then, with the election, honestly, and the divisiveness that we've seen on the left and the right, I've really tried to evolve it to be a much more bipartisan platform and a much more of a conversation. So even though I personally am conservative, I was opposed to Donald Trump, but I was also never Hillary, which was a really difficult road to hoe in terms of I was getting it from both sides.
Right. So when you kind of come up with you want to be a right-wing Mike.com, how do you kind of go from there to where you are now? Is it you're testing the potential market, you're testing test audiences, and you're finding, maybe Mike.com of the right isn't what you're best at or what you might be able to cater to. And so you want to bring in, because I think Bold has done a fairly good job of getting people who come from different ideological backgrounds to discuss certain issues, and you have a good diversity of viewpoint on the site. So where do you go from I want to be a conservative site to I'm bringing in people from everywhere to discuss some of these issues? And I think, like you said, maybe the viewpoint-based, sole viewpoint-based, the left or the right or whatever, isn't going to work for you, and you kind of evolve to a point where you are like, well, I need to bring in kind of everyone, not just be speaking to this, online right-wing audience.
Yeah. So, and first of all, I have to always put the caveat that what we are doing is evolving, and that I am obviously a very imperfect person. So when I say this is what I'm aiming to do, I can tell you now, I will not execute it perfectly, but I will do the best that I can. So, But I think that what this election reiterated to me was just how much of a divide we have from the left and the right. And I think it traces back to really the 1960s, where, for the first couple hundred years before, during our founding fathers' time and up until the 60s, we were a much more unified country. In terms of culture and the way that we viewed things and the way we kind of behaved, kind of the Americana and the American civil language. And the 1960s were a period of tumult. They were a period of really a coming apart in terms of a lot of behaviors on the cultural front. And I don't think that there's been a healthy middle ground. I think it's something we've been struggling with since the 60s, where conservatives have not found a healthy balance in terms of how to talk about gender issues or civil rights issues. But then also on the left, all the data suggests that the policies under LBJ and the Great Society have been very detrimental to the African American family, and are really exacerbating a lot of the cultural problems that we see in our inner city areas. So, and a lot of white liberals are not willing to concede that. And I think now this new era of President Trump is going to, at least they're going to have to listen to us in terms of what we've been saying for the last 50 years.
Yeah, that's an interesting, I think, place that we are now. What I want to ask you about, actually, because of we're in the era of Trump, you were a never Trump person. I'm also a never Trump person. But obviously we have President Trump now for at least the next 4 years, potentially longer. At Bold, I don't know if you have any people on staff or who are contributors who were explicitly pro-Trump, but do you see Donald Trump win the election? And because you're an organization that wants to bring in viewpoints from kind of all over the place, do you think I need to have more pro-Trump people in my organization? Have I missed kind of the motivating factor of what makes a Trump voter? Am I not serving the viewpoint of Trump, potentially pro-Trump audience members appropriately? Do you find, and I know this is something the mainstream media has struggled with, is getting people in their newsrooms or on their editorial team that understand kind of, even if they're not explicitly pro-Trump, understand kind of what a Trump voter is, because obviously they missed it so big during the election. So do you find, as someone who's built a media team and an editorial team, that you might have missed the Trump thing because you didn't have those kind of diversity opinions? And do you think that you need to find that going forward?
Well, I don't think that I missed. I know why Trump won. I know the forces that animated his rise. I am a frequent guest on Fox. I was an editorial writer for the Washington Times, a contributor to Forbes. So, and my brother, who you've had on your program, Matt Sheffield, he founded Newsbusters, which is, explicitly devoted to combating liberal bias in the mainstream press. And so I've helped him with that launch and helped him while he was doing that project. He's since moved on. But, I understand liberal bias, and that's having worked in the mainstream press and, spent time with a lot of liberal journalists. It's not, again, the data says 80 to 90% of quote unquote mainstream journalists are liberal or Democrats. And that's just, quantifiable fact. So for me, I feel in some ways liberated by Donald Trump. I feel like for all these liberal reporters who did not respect my background as a conservative and honestly treated me with derision, I feel like I don't have to be subject to that anymore, which is a nice feeling. But at the same time, I did not like how extreme Trump was in the way that he did it. I compare it to like a war or like the Civil War, or just, I'm not pro-war. I don't like a lot of the tactics that were used, but the ultimate outcome, I am now more favorable toward a Trump president than a President Hillary. As I said, I was never Trump and never Hillary, but because of the fact that I'm conservative, the people that Trump is surrounding himself with are people that I'm much more, aligned with. And a lot of my friends are now transitioning or part of the transition team. And so I don't think that I missed why he won. It was just more that myself personally, I had to make that decision on my end. But certainly at Bold, we had lots of Trump people on our TV show. So we have a television show that we shoot on Friday mornings. It's produced by Al Roker's people. Al Roker is a nonpartisan individual. He's the co-host of the Today Show. And the Today Show has left and right. And so on our talk show, we've had Trump surrogates. We've had someone from the Trump Diversity Initiative, Latino communities, someone from Trump's Muslim outreach. He's a surrogate for Trump on the Muslim issues. We've had Larry Kudlow, who is a chief economic advisor to Donald Trump. I've interviewed him, as well as Anthony Scaramucci has come on our TV programming. He's another economic advisor of Donald Trump. We also had the head of Women for Trump, or an organizer for Women for Trump. So, and we just hired an editor who is very pro-Trump, who lives in Missouri, outside the bubble. So I'm very aware, and that just, I think, comes as a function of someone who has grown up in conservative circles, that I'm very favorable to working with people who are pro-Trump. It's just that I could not endorse the rhetoric, and even Trump himself has admitted that a lot of his supporters have been, really just not civil in how they were behaving, and just couldn't endorse the fact that he was, calling for violence at his rallies. Those were just things that I just personally could not get behind, even though I'm certainly through the Bold platform encouraging all perspectives.
Sure. Being able to talk to Trump supporters, obviously having actual surrogates to talk to is a huge step forward, because honestly, as someone who's a conservative who works in journalism myself, there's a certain bubble even within the conservative journalism world. 90% of Republicans in the country voted for Donald Trump, and I think that number is much lower in kind of conservative journalism circles. You see a lot of the quote unquote never Trump movement. I would say seriously overrepresented at kind of top brass. I know, like, a lot of members of the Wall Street Journal editorial board were anti-Trump. National Review had their big against Trump issue. So honestly, even within kind of conservative journalism, the anti-Trump faction, I think, was overrepresented. So I think you've done a great job of reaching out and obviously understanding where the Trump voters and the Trump support comes from. I wanted to ask you, because we talked a little bit before about how Bold got started and where you guys are, and you described to me that you're kind of in an innovation incubator startup environment in New York, and I thought it was super interesting. So could you tell me a little bit kind of about how that innovation and startup environment works for a media company like yours?
Sure, yeah. So the community that we first got started in is called Silicon Harlem. It's just siliconharlem.net. And it's dedicated to accelerating and incubating tech and other types of startups in Harlem. It's not part of the Silicon Alley, which is where all the sleek, San Francisco-based or tied institutions tend to be, which is in southern, much wealthier part of New York. It's Harlem, which is more organic. Yes, Harlem is gentrifying, and it's having its own growth as well. And a lot of people are actually, some of them are being displaced, and they can't afford Harlem anymore, and they're moving to the Bronx. But there are tech communities and incubators in Bronx as well. But we were just very committed to working in Harlem because of the historical significance of Harlem in terms of being an epicenter of African-American culture, and working with community leaders in Harlem. And a friend of mine, Richard Ivory, I got to give him a shout out. He founded a blog called Hip Hop Republican. I believe he founded it in 2008. He used to work for Michael Steele, the first Black RNC director. But Richard has been a great confidant and sounding board for Bold and for our project, and he lives here in New York also. Because for him, he's very thoughtful in terms of understanding the history of Black voters and the Republican Party, and it was good to see that Republicans, in my view, went from 5% to 8% for Trump versus 5% for Romney in 12, but that's still pretty pitiful in my mind in terms of the potential that's not being tapped, especially when you look at kind of the electoral history. In 1956, it was 39% for Dwight Eisenhower and 32% for Richard Nixon. In 1960, and then by 1964, it went to 6%. So that was the year Barry Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act. And going back to what I was saying before, conservatives have not found a reconciling way to look at these issues. And the Southern strategy and kind of the focus to the party more as a rural party. Again, as someone who I graduated high school in the Ozarks, which is southwest Missouri. That's, if you've ever seen the film Winter's Bone, which was the film that gave Jennifer Lawrence her basically successful audition for the Hunger Games. Winter's Bone is set based on a book that's set in Springfield, Missouri, which is where I graduated high school, which is lots of meth problems, just a lot of the dystopia that people talk about. Was fueling a lot of the anger for Trump voters. So I understand that. Like I said, it's just that I think when we have such a bifurcated approach to voter outreach in terms of Republicans not doing enough to talk to everyone, I think that becomes a problem.
Yeah. And I think there's kind of a dual approach here. There are a lot of people right now trying to reach out to voters who are in rural areas who might have been overrepresented in voting for Trump. But I think what you're doing is really interesting, and I don't want to frame it as like opposite or completely in the other direction, but a kind of conservative reach out to urban voters who are traditionally a Democratic constituency, and since the Goldwater years kind of trended so far to the left that, places like New York City vote heavily Democrat. I live in Washington, D.C., which votes 90% Democrat. So where did you, I think, decide to make the focus of Bold on urban issues, on kind of more city-focused issues, more cosmopolitan issues, rather than, obviously, where you came from, your background, which is more in not Central America, but Middle America, more where a lot of the media is focusing on now for the Trump voters, the rural voters, the drug problems that are affecting Americans. Where did you kind of decide that you wanted to focus on more cosmopolitan rather than more of the urban issues or more of the rural issues?
Sure. Well, for me, again, I don't see my work as either or with my particular voice. That's part of why I'm still very involved with Fox and very involved with speaking to those audiences, which is more aligned with my upbringing. However, I also, when I was younger, before moving down to that area where Winter's Bone was based on, I also lived in some urban areas as well. My dad, I call him a Mormon hippie, so he's very, very conservative, but he's also very just kind of goes with the wind. But I actually went to schools where I was one of the only white kids. For example, in Kansas City, Missouri, which was an inner city school program that actually lost their accreditation because it was so low functioning. And one of my schools was, I believe it was something like 96% African American. And so I had that experience of being in a trapped and failing school where every morning I had to wait in line for an hour to go through metal detectors, to sit in a classroom where kids were fighting and throwing chairs at each other and academics were just completely not important. So I had that experience in addition to this rural experience. So I think with my career, I am trying to speak to all sides. It's just that with Bold in particular, I see more of a need. I call it the question of preaching to the choir versus getting new choir members. So I like to be able to do both. But with Bold in particular, I see so much of a need and a void. And so that's where the focus of Bold is right now. But as I said, I like to bring everyone to the table. And in fact, I want to get both sides talking to each other. Yeah.
And how have you found it, I guess, trying to get new choir members, trying to convert more people? How does your audience receive the messages that you're pushing?
Well, and so that's part of like I said, the evolution of really trying to make this be a bipartisan dialogue, is that I've gotten to know some really great millennial brands that tend to be very liberal and tend to lean to the left. So, for example, Silicon Harlem, which is a very nonpartisan, bipartisan institution, they hosted a debate in Harlem for the seat that was being vacated by Charlie Rangel, who was a longtime fixture in Harlem. And, he's not going to be in office next year. And so it was this huge historic opening to have a successor for him. And so Bold was able to be a co-sponsor along with MTV and MSNBC anchors, as well as a conservative website that I also provide content for called opportunitylives.com, which works with Speaker House Ryan on issues of poverty and income mobility. And so I would have to check whatever history books, but I'm pretty sure it was probably the only time a conservative had moderated such a debate in Harlem. So the fact that we could work with MTV and MSNBC and also just with our regular TV programming, I'm bringing in brands that are like bustle.com, which is a very liberal very popular millennial women's site. We've had guests as well on our show from other sites that tend to be more left-leaning. And just, other millennial brands as well. It's been exciting to be able to work with them because, it's interesting because I was already building these relationships before Trump, and now that Trump has won, I feel like, I spent 10 years just trying to listen and learn from liberals, and now we're in an era where liberals have to listen to conservatives. So, So I think that, it's definitely a season of opportunity where I think about, to your question on how is it being received, my goal in life is to really help people flourish and to help people have a happy, good life. And I think that most of that actually happens away from government. I mean, as a small government advocate, I really want to empower the individual. And so whether or not someone ends up voting the way I would like them to vote, to me is less relevant than, are they living principles of self-reliance or principles of self-empowerment, and also, being accountable for the choices that you make versus, kind of surrendering your power to an authority like the government, or expecting someone else to, basically cover for, not to say that, we don't want compassion, but it's just, again, to the LBJ problems, it's like we've exacerbated a lot of the problems. Like Ronald Reagan would say, the worst terrifying words in the English language can be, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Right, yeah. So that's almost all the time we have, but I know you mentioned earlier you've worked with Al Roker, and I know there's a project that you guys are working on that you wanted to promote with him. So why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So Al Roker has a side production company. It is separate from his duties at the Today Show, but through his work there, he's got access to the best producers and talent in the business, and so he's got his own production company called Roker Media, and they've been piloting different talk shows. So, a food talk show, entertainment. I mean, all different types of genres they look at, and we're his first political and news talk show. And so it's really exciting. We're shooting it on Friday mornings. My co-anchor is Clay Aiken from American Idol and The Apprentice, who just was on The View, actually doing a historic duet with Ruben, who was the guy who ended up winning. But Clay became very well known himself, despite being second place on American Idol. So Clay also ran for Congress in 2014 down in North Carolina, where he's from. So Clay and I have, we like to call it our morning Joe for millennials shtick. So he's progressive, I'm conservative. So again, being bipartisan and having this conversation, and Al Roker is helping us produce the show. We'd love for all your listeners to check it out, your viewers. We shoot on Friday mornings, typically at 10 a.m. on Facebook Live and across other platforms. And so 2017, I think, is going to be a year to build and rebuild, and it'll be exciting to see where we go.
Sure thing. Well, thanks a lot for being with me today, Carrie, and was thrilled to have you on. Glad that I could have you on, since you said you were a longtime viewer of Blogging Heads.
Yes, no, of course. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
And for everyone else, I'll see you guys next time on Blogging Heads.
Great. Bye, guys.